Welcome to the Communication Workshop. I'm Abby Wick. I'm the NDSU Extension Soil Health Specialist. So I work primarily with farmers, with other educators, including our county agents and our CS organizations, anyone that brings information out to people that are going to put it on the ground. So that's my role at NDSU.
My name is Tim Hamrich. I work in communications consulting. I have been hosting the Soil Sense podcast along with Abby for the last over a year now, almost 2 years going on for that podcast, and I've been in communications for several years.
There's some really cool things that Jean Haley may talk about during her presentation where we can track all the communication and the chatter about the workshop today on Twitter or on other social media platforms. But Twitter is our primary, I think, for this. But we'll introduce Jean Haley with Haley Consulting Services. I met Jean, gosh, she'd be able to tell you how many years ago, but it's been a while, and she's helped with all of the evaluation that we've done for the soil health program. And so I wanted to share that evaluation and the information she's brought to me with the audience here, because I think it's incredibly valuable. And it shows that evaluation doesn't have to be just one more thing you have to do. It can actually be something to guide your program and to make it better, to improve the way you deliver that content, and then also the way that people receive it too. So I'm excited for this session. I think, Jean, you have a PowerPoint that you're going to show.
I do. After all that with Lee telling us about not to use these boring PowerPoints, I'm a little nervous. But I think it's going to be okay. It is, evaluation is one of those kind of talking head things. I wasn't able to bring my other evaluation pals to the party, but hopefully Abby's going to help also jump in when she's got some examples to share as well.
I think, Jean, what we'll do is, as we get questions on the chat or the Q&A, we'll make sure that we just kind of, if it's okay with you, if we interrupt you, to kind of ask you those questions to make sure that we're still engaging the audience. And I'd be happy to weigh in whenever I can. And then Tim did that great Soil Sense episode with you on evaluation. So
I learned a lot. Yeah, and keep the chat going for everybody, with us. The chat has been fantastic this morning. Abby and I couldn't catch up on all of it in the little 15-minute break because it's been so robust. So please keep that going. There's a lot of connections being made there and a lot of processing happening. So encourage that to continue, and looking forward to learning more from Jean, because this is a very, very important topic.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. So let's go ahead and put that PowerPoint up if we can, and I'll try not to make it too boring. So this is me. I am Jean Haley. I'm Haley Consulting Services. I'm located in Bloomington, Indiana, and you can reach me at jean@usableknowledge.com. I am all about the usable knowledge, as Abby knows. Otherwise, it's just trivia, and I really prefer my trivia at the pub with a beer. So for programs, I like to do evaluation. So jumping right in, everybody evaluates all the time. We're constantly evaluating what it is that we're doing. We go to a new town, we want to know where the best coffee shop is. We want to figure out where the best place to go to school is for our kids, or if we're looking at universities or any kind of learning program, we're evaluating which ones we need or want to do. I need a new car. So this is top on my mind all the time right now. What do I actually need this car for? Am I more concerned about gas mileage, or do I want to be able to haul around art installations, or what is it that I need? So that's an evaluation that I'm doing right now, pretty much every day of my life right now, trying to figure out the car thing. Everybody does it in the kitchen too, whether you're the cook or you're next to the cook. Testing it as you go is an important thing. This is often, cooking soup is often a metaphor that's used for evaluation, because there's a couple of different kinds of evaluation that happen in the world. The two most common are called formative evaluation, and this happens when you're in the kitchen and you're cooking the soup and you're tasting it to make sure it's got the right spices. Is it salty enough? Is it too salty? What do I need to adjust as I'm going? And so there's still time to do something about it while I'm testing it in the kitchen. And then the summative evaluation is when you have everybody over at that dinner party and they're all tasting the soup and they're giving that final, it's delicious, or, oh my God, there's too much soup, too much salt. So that's really what a summative evaluation is in the kitchen. So how does this really relate to our programs? How do we make that relevant for our programs? Well, the first thing that we can do, if we hit the next slide, is we can do a needs assessment. And I'm not talking about any big, onerous needs assessment, research, gap analysis thing. I am talking about, down and dirty, but, think about what it is. What do you need to evaluate? Why do you need to evaluate? Who needs to be served by the evaluation? When does it need to happen? And what's your budget? These 5 questions are going to really guide what you can and should be doing for your evaluation. So very briefly, what do you need to evaluate? Is it a program for a grant? Is it a field day? Is it personnel? What is it that you're actually needing to evaluate, and why are you having to evaluate it? Do you need to be able to report back to your funder? Do you need to be able to tell your boss what you did, or your department head? We're going to come back to this, the who question in a minute, because we just talked about a few of the who's. Your funder, your boss, your department head. But there's another who that's often missing from this equation. I'll come back to that. When does it need to be done? Do you have 2 weeks? Do you have 2 months? Do you have 2 years? What's your time frame? And how much money do you have, or other resources do you have? In evaluation, I'm often telling my clients that, if I know what your budget is and your timeline, I can actually design something for you that will fit. I can build a canoe, or I could build an ocean liner. Do you need to get across a pond, or do you need to get across the Great Lakes, or do you need to go to Europe? If you're in the States, that's across the ocean. So depending on what the situation is and how much time and money you have, you can build different frameworks and evaluations to fit what your needs are. And I really think that even for those small programs that don't have a lot of money, you can still do something that's going to give you some data and help you decide. So back to this who question. Let's focus on that for a minute. On the next slide, I want you to all remember that you are, on the next slide, the center of your universe, okay? You're right there in the middle of your universe, so make it useful for you. 9 times out of 10, when I'm giving evaluation talks, people are being forced to do evaluation. That decision has been made for them. You have to do this. This is part of your job and not at all what you went to school for. And so it's this big onerous task and, not something you're really excited about doing. Well, if you make sure that the data is useful for you and what you need, it might be able to go from that circle of stuff I hate, up one more into stuff that's about me. So it's a little bit more likable and a little bit more bearable. So this is I think one of the key components that's missing a lot for people who need to evaluate their programs. So back to the needs assessment. We've done our needs assessment, and then what happens next? Next slide. I'm going to go briefly through this little diagram. The way I approach evaluation is it's a feedback loop, okay? It's a system. You decide to evaluate, or somebody makes that decision for you. And then you need to do that needs assessment. What do I need to evaluate? Why? Who is it serving? When is it happening? What's my budget? And then from those questions, once we've got those answers, we're going to develop a framework. And once we get that framework in the US pretty much is going to be your logic model. For those of us in the States who have any kind of USDA money, you probably did a logic model for your grant or for your program at some point along the way. And that's going to serve as your framework. And then you're going to select your methods. The reason I have that big do not go this way path there, the decision to evaluate straight over to methods, that might look a little silly, but it's what happens so often. People go, oh, I got to evaluate. I need a survey. I need to do an evaluation. I got to get a survey. So as scientists, most of us, most of you out there, I think, are scientists in some capacity. You would never in a million years select your method before you knew what your research question was. So evaluation, same thing. Don't select survey just because you have to do evaluation. You need to know what your question is. What's your research question? What do you want to know? You need to do that needs assessment to figure out what the methods are that are going to be the most appropriate. So if yes.
Okay, so if we're constantly taking that path right to the method selection from being told we have to evaluate, do you think that's why so much of this information just gets shelved and it never gets used to actually improve a program or just check a box?
Yes, I do. I think that's an excellent point, Abby. That is a reason why stuff gets shelved, and also because it's not about me, right? I've collected this data for somebody else, for for their needs, and so I'm just doing this thing for them that I need to get, check that box, get it done, so that I can move on and get to the stuff that I think is important, my programming. And so yeah, it gets left on that shelf because it's like, oh, okay, I have to do this survey, and it doesn't end up being useful to anybody, and maybe not even the funder, because it's not really the questions that they were looking to be answered. I'm going to try to keep it narrowed down. There's going to be a lot of information, but I've got three main things that I want you to remember by the end. But really, just this is really just to let you know, it is a system, just like any research that you're doing for your own programs, or if you're a farmer, you're constantly evaluating your system on your farm. So evaluating programs and projects, it's similar. There's some steps you need to go through. What do you need to know? How, and then how are you going to get that information? And then in evaluation, we're going to develop an instrument that's, appropriate for that method. Pardon me, and we're going to implement it, meaning we're going to collect our data, we're going to analyze it, we're going to report on it, and hopefully we're going to act to improve because we've taken the time to collect data that matters to us and to our programs. And the reason this is a feedback loop is because once you've changed that system in any way, you need to kind of go back and revisit that needs assessment to make sure that you're still answering the right questions with your evaluation. Maybe your questions need to get tweaked a little bit. You found out some things and you tried some new things. And so, how do I find out about this next step? And so just go back and revisit it. And again, it doesn't need to be any big onerous research program gap analysis thing. You just need to really sit down and think and be thoughtful about what information do I need and why do I need it? And that's going to make it a lot more purposeful and really increase the likelihood of getting usable knowledge out of it. So since all surveys do not lead to, since all evaluations do not lead to surveys, what are some of these other methods that we could be using? And that would be on the next slide. So it's a very busy slide, and I'm just going to hang out here for a while. And I'm going to go through some of these things. This is not by any stretch an exhaustive list of evaluation methods that you could use. These are some of the things that I believe are at your disposal, no matter who you are, online right now. If you're at all involved in extension in any way, these methods are things that you can do and could do easily. We all know the surveys because we've all been doing them and we've been surveyed to death. It's part of our culture now. Every time you do anything, you can't turn around without getting another survey. And that's unfortunate for those of us who try to do it for a living. Other things, secondary data, don't forget that other people are collecting data all the time. Let somebody else pay for your data, right? National Ag Statistics, they collect a ton of data. ERS, Economic Research Service, they collect a ton of data. Your local governments, your local schools, there's other groups, NGOs, they're collecting a ton of data all the time. Let them collect their data and then you can use their data. And that's going to help inform what you're doing. There's nothing that says that you have to pay for whatever the data is that you're collecting. Somebody else might have already done this research. So don't reinvent wheels and, don't do extra work that you don't necessarily have to do. There's also pre-test, post-tests. In an academic setting, that's, definitely Marisol is going to be using things like this with her classes. Maybe not the pre-test, but if you've got, data from last year, that could be your baseline. If you've got a program, it's kind of a really terrible way to start a program is with a pre-test, but maybe you can ask a couple of questions at the beginning and, identification of, what are these things at the beginning? And then at the end of whatever your programming is, ask them again about identifying these same things and see, does their score go up? You can do that through, paper and pencil if you're in person, but like Marisol and Peter talked about this morning, you can do live polling, whether you're on Zoom or you're on any other kind of situation, you can do live polling. You can do this out in the field too. that Turning Point Technologies, back in the day, they had clickers. We didn't all have phones, and so they had clickers that we would use. And you could do that live in the field. People always have their phones with them. You can do it live in the field. But right now we're mostly online, and you can do it online, build in the polls using Zoom, using Turning Point, using some of the other, there were some other methods that, sources that people put up in the chat. Build those right into your presentations. And some of them go right into your gradebook if that's something that you need. But otherwise, it's data that can be downloaded and collected. This spring, I was working with a group who was supposed to have a live full day training session in March. And that, of course, didn't happen. And so it was right at the beginning of COVID. And, they weren't sure what to do, but they knew they had to cancel it. They were getting a little bit of feedback, a little pushback from the people who were supposed to take the workshop saying, hey, we really want this information. What can we do? And so they decided to go ahead and give Zoom a try. So this was, back in the early days of not everybody and their, mother and grandmother and grandbabies knew how to use Zoom. This was pretty early on, so it was very experimental for them. They split it up over several days. And one of the things that they were able to do was use that polling from Zoom right there in the webinar, and collect some data. We put some data, some questions at the end about, how useful was this for you? Or just gathering maybe zip code data, or are you a farmer or a consultant, or, getting some of that demographic data that we always want to be collecting. They were able to build that right in and didn't have to then send a survey out to anybody at the end. We just built a couple of really quick, simple questions in at the end, got that data downloaded into Excel, and then, we were able to analyze it and crank out some graphs. So really easy, low cost.
How much is too much for live polling? I mean, if you put up 10 questions, or how much is too much, or where's that kind of sweet spot for what you ask for online during an actual event?
So I think that's a great question, Abby. I think that, when you're doing live polling and you're an online event, you don't want to be able to, you're not going to be able to collect the same kind of information that you would if you were to send a survey, an online survey, or hand out a survey at an in-person meeting, where you can expect somebody to sit down for 3 to 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes if you give them that and build it into your program. You can't expect them to stick around at the end of a Zoom call for 10 minutes to fill out all your questions. But what you can do is throw in 2 or 3 and just collect some nitty gritty. If what you want to know is, if all you really want to know is, did they learn anything? You can ask them, hey, what was your knowledge on this topic beforehand? What was your knowledge afterwards? Rated on this scale from none to I'm an expert. And so just a couple of really quick questions. And then you could also sprinkle them throughout. Like Marisol said, when she's in her classrooms and situations, she's got all these ID slides now. As she's presenting, she can throw up a slide and say, hey, which of these are, whatever kind of forage. I'm not exactly sure what the terminologies are, but you know what I'm saying? So, sprinkle them throughout. Don't make it a full, 10 minutes of sitting here and answering questions. Nobody wants to do that. So put yourself, when you're designing this, put yourself in the position of a participant, right? So present something that you would want to present to yourself. And if you're going to sit there and go, oh, I don't want to answer, 6 of these questions in a row. I'm not going to be able to hang. I'm going to bail. I'm done. Then don't do that, right? Just kind of use a little bit of common sense. But that's a great question. You're not going to get the in-depth information that you would get if you did data collection in another way, in a more in-depth way.
You mentioned earlier, make sure that your method matches what you're trying to get, what you're trying to get answered. If you're trying to get multiple things answered, should you evaluate the method for each one of those? Or should you try to find the best comprehensive method that would get you everything you want to know?
Great question. So that's going to come back to that needs assessment. You've got more components of not just what it is that you want to know, but what's your time and budget, right? So again, it's, do I need a canoe to get across a lake, or do I need an ocean liner, or at least something more, substantial than a canoe? So those are kinds of, we're going to get to that a little bit after after this. I'm going to talk about how do you fit those things together and kind of figure that out. But that's a great question. It can be, at first it's like, well, how do I know which method is the best method? And you just you got to kind of be creative and give yourself the space and time to think about what is the best way to get this information and the most cost effective, and the least time consuming and the least onerous for other people in the equation. I still want to stick on that methods for a second, because I do want to also point out that observation is something that is overlooked a lot. No pun intended there. But I think that this is a tool that could be used very effectively. Abby, when we first started working together, in the very first time I came in and did an observation of one of your workshops, do you remember what happened with that? Do you want to share what happened with that? One of the very first things I think I said.
Oh, I'm trying to think about which workshop you would have evaluated, if it was the CTC or DIRT
It was a CTC, and it had to do with the amount of time getting from session to session.
Yeah, we had the small group discussion sessions, and I think we had county extension agents at each one of them collecting some of this observation data. And it was actually really helpful because they talked about, were people paying attention? They kind of talked about the information that was discussed, or not necessarily the specifics of it, but how it was discussed, or the way they moved through it. Jean, am I remembering right? Because
you are remembering. The other example that I was thinking of, though, was, sorry to put you on the spot like that. But the other example was when I first got there, the agenda went straight from, 9 to 9:30 XYZ, 9:30 to 10, ABC. And there was no time built in to get from one session to the other. Now, this is obviously for an in-person thing. So online, you can back things up back to back, and it makes more sense to do that. But in this particular example, Abby, you know which one I'm talking about now?
I do, yeah, because we used to have 5-minute transfers. You'd go from one session to another, and you'd have 5 minutes to get from one place to the next. And what Jean had recognized through this observation was that that's not nearly enough time. And so we expanded out to 15 minutes, which allowed for people to ask questions of the presenters prior to moving on to the next session. They could grab some coffee, they could have a hallway conversation, then they could get there at their leisure. And that was a big discovery for us, because we were trying to cram in so much content and give people all the information we possibly could that we forgot that people actually like to just talk with each other. So yeah, that was a huge thing for us, Jean.
Yeah, and so part of that, the reason that could happen is because my whole job there was to observe, right? And so when you're the person putting together a big event, whether that's a big couple-day workshop or a field day, or, even a couple-hour, presentation workshop kind of situation, that's not what your job is, to not see what's going on all the time. Your job is to make sure all that stuff's going to work and happen and go smoothly, right? But also, like Lee spoke about this morning, when he was talking about when he's presenting, he's looking at that body language constantly. He's trying to see, are people yawning? Are they nodding their heads? Are they, what's it look like out there? Are they all on their phones? Are they checking their mail? Are they texting with their pals? These are all things that, when you're presenting during a presentation, you can see all of that. But it's not necessarily your job to do that all day long. And so if you assign somebody to do that and just give them a very easy observation form to use to fill out, and like the one that Abby described, what were some of the topics? How engaged were people? You could just use hash marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for every time somebody new speaks during a conversation or a presentation. How many of the panelists are involved in the responses or the discussion? Is it more discussion, or is it just a quick answer? Answer done. These are the kinds of things that are going to help you understand how well your workshop or presentation is being received. And if you collect that data methodically and systematically, then it's data. It's not just anecdotal. I kind of saw this one thing happen, right? You've got a form and you're filling it out, and you're keeping notes. And these notes can really affect how you interpret other data as well. And this, another example of when I was working with Abby and it was with the cafe talks, and we did a survey because, we all do love surveys, but I did a survey and we were asking them about their practices. And when I was looking at the data for the practices that they were adopting versus what the topics were that were covered during those cafe talks, there were some links that, I, from the outside, that's not my job, is the understanding the content necessarily. I didn't necessarily make these connections, but Abby, you made a really important connection, from that pretty quickly.
Yeah, I remember seeing that we had talked about, for example, that we talked about no-till 100% of the time. But we found, oh gosh, Jean, remind me again. Sorry, I'm not good at being put on the spot today, I guess.
I'm so sorry. I should have given you my cues at the beginning. So yeah, so the data was all about the cover crops. The cover crops, almost all of the practices that the folks were considering adopting or having had adopted were about cover crops. And that was also talked about 100% of the time, but so was no-till and tillage, but those weren't the practices that were being adopted. And so I think at that point, Abby, you pivoted, you stopped, talking necessarily about, one thing and went toward the thing that was going to help them move along that no-till spectrum anyway. It's like, okay, cover crops is kind of the gateway drug to no-till. Let's focus on cover crops because this is what's working. Am I remembering correctly? Or
you are, Jean, you always assign a good method to my madness, which is great. Makes me feel really good about what I do.
Well, good, because it works. I think we make a good team that way. One of the other things, going back to those cafe talks too, was Abby, I think you knew instinctively that, part of what you were doing was building these networks and farmer networks, but you didn't really have any idea how to, measure that or, what kind of method to put to that. And so that's where we started doing some network analysis. And can you share how has that been helpful to understand what those networks look like? And
yeah, I think that's been really helpful because I used to, everybody knows when they're having these conversations that there's a key farmer or a consultant or other researcher or person that you're working with that's going to be kind of your, I don't want to call a node, right? I mean, that's going to be the person you go to that's going to share this information with others. And you kind of instinctively pick those people out of your groups. But then when you put them into a network analysis and you find out that those are the same people other people are constantly going to, then it assigns some kind of validity to, your approach and lets you know who those people are that are key components for sharing information. So yeah, I mean, Jean, I always knew kind of in my head which farmers were going to be the ones that were sharing a lot of information or which consultants or other researchers or extension. And then to see that in the diagram because other people felt that same way was really helpful for making sure that I get them the most accurate information I possibly can, or make sure that they're put in opportunities where they can share that information.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the other things that can happen when we're doing that network analysis, so there are a couple of kinds of networks, and this isn't going to be a presentation about doing survey social network analysis, but network analysis can be really helpful because there's the network of association. So by virtue of having attended this conference, you're part of this network right now. Whether you participated in any information exchange or not, you're there just because you were part of it. You were there. There are other where we're looking at more in depth, like what is this information exchange? How does information move through a network? And really it's the medical fields that were the first ones who were really using this to, what we stole from them was they were looking at how disease moves through networks. So sometimes for us, for information dissemination, we want a really dense network. We want to, as dense as we can get it. We have more people connected to more people, then the information is going to get through that more quickly. If you've got a global pandemic, you really don't want a tight network, right? We want to keep our distance and we want to make sure that, we're keeping far enough away so that we're not all, getting this, infected with this disease. But we would like people to be infected with the information. So figuring out what that network looks like, we asked our farmers, who are the top 3 people you talk to, top 3 growers you talk to about soil health in the past year. And we then asked them, who are the top 3 non-growers that you speak to about soil health over the past year. And then we were able to build that network out. And so even though I have specific names, we don't share that whenever we share the data, they're just dots and lines. And there are going to be some people who are highly connected and will know, oh, there's Abby, oh, there's Lee Breeze. And there's nothing we can do about that. But for the rest of the network, what's nice to understand, one of the things we discovered this last time when I pulled out all of the non-growers and just looked at the grower network, and then put back in all of the NDSU personnel that were named by growers. So this wasn't just because the personnel were at a meeting or anything, but we mapped back in who the NDSU personnel were, who were named by growers as people they speak to the most often about soil health. The network was 3 times more dense. And so when you take that away, that NDSU component away, then that information getting through that network was going to have too many breaks, and it was going to stop with some certain people, and then that was it. It wasn't going to go any further because it just had clumps of people. Whereas if you had that NDSU component in there, that network was a lot more connected. So this is something that tells, your departments and your funders, hey, it's worth paying for these cheeseburgers at these meetings because we're connecting these people and they're getting connected to each other. And then that information is going to continue to flow through the system. This is really the summary, is do your needs assessment so you know exactly what it is you need to assess and why you need to assess it. Don't forget that you're the center of your universe, so make it useful for you and consider all the methods that are available to you.
Jean, really appreciate your time and looking forward to your next session.